The boy is 7 years old, small and trying not to cry. The rope burns where it bites his wrist. The deck rocks like a cruel joke, and the sea says something only a child can hear. Hold on. The lanterns sway, turning the faces of the men into masks, and their whispers intertwine greed and malice as if it were easy. Caleb holds his father's words in his mouth like a pebble. Stand still while fear counts. But fear has long arms when you are tied to the railing. Across the water, boots pounded on wet boards, the radio hissed, and somewhere, a heartbeat he had never known came to him on all fours. Before the first splinter flew, before the sparks hit the steel and bounced off into the mist, a dog sniffed the wind and sensed a boy's terror as if it were a rope tied to his chest. If you stay with me, you will see how the rope breaks, how loyalty outlasts bullets, and how a child's faith learns the shape of a shepherd's shoulders. The harbor had its own kind of silence, one that never truly slept. Even when the town lights had dimmed and the taverns closed their doors, the sea kept whispering against the pilings, ships groaning softly as if they carried memories too heavy to set down. Tonight, that silence pressed heavier than usual, the kind that made seasoned men like Ethan Ward trust their instincts more than their eyes. He stood at the edge of Dock 12, boots planted on damp planks, his breath ghosting in the fog that rolled low and thick over the water. The lantern beside him threw a circle of gold no wider than a man's arm span, swallowed quickly by the mist. Beyond it, shadows moved where they shouldn't, too quick to be the sway of ropes, too deliberate to be the flap of canvas. Ethan narrowed his eyes, his hand instinctively brushing the handle of the flashlight on his belt. Years of service had taught him to respect the docks at night. They were the arteries of the town's livelihood, but also the back door to its darkest dealings. Smugglers had long used these waters, threading shipments of contraband beneath the nose of honest sailors. He had broken up enough operations to know that what looked still could erupt in violence with the smallest spark. A gull cried overhead, startling him from his thoughts. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself. It wasn't fear that gnawed at him. It was memory. 2 years ago, he had missed the signs. A shipment had come through under his watch, a boat that should have been flagged and inspected. Days later, a boy not much older than his own Caleb had been found unconscious in a warehouse, a victim of a smuggled chemical he hadn't stopped. The boy had survived, but Ethan had carried that failure like an anchor ever since. He had sworn that night, standing over his sleeping son's bed, that he would never again let his guard down, not while this harbor still breathed. Not while Caleb still looked at him with those wide, trusting eyes. The fog shifted, and Ethan leaned forward, scanning the line of moored vessels. One in particular, a rust-streaked trawler with no name painted on her bow, caught his attention. She hadn't been here the previous night. Her lines sagged unevenly, like she had been tied in haste, and her deck sat too low in the water, as though she carried more than fish in her belly. He made a mental note. Dock 12, third berth. He would call it in once he circled the south end. But he didn't move just yet. Instead, he let the quiet wash over him again, listening. Ships talked if you had the patience to hear them. A groan in the hull, a clink of chain. Each had its story. Tonight, though, the sounds came in rhythm, a muffled thump, as though boots paced back and forth on wood, meant to be still. He frowned. Definitely movement. A shift in the air brought the faint tang of tobacco. Ethan's jaw tightened. Smoking was forbidden on the docks, too great a risk with the fuel lines. Whoever was here had either no fear of consequences or no care for the law. He reached for his radio, but hesitated. Part of him wanted to walk straight onto that trawler, to drag whoever lingered there into the lamplight. But another part reminded him of Caleb, sleeping at home, and of his promise. Recklessness wasn't vigilance. It was ego wearing a badge. He needed to be smart. He turned, letting his eyes sweep the length of the waterfront. Each pier stretched into the darkness like skeletal fingers. The tide slapped against the pilings in a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat beneath the town. Somewhere out in that haze, men were moving goods not meant for these shores. He could feel it in the way the air seemed to hold its breath. Ethan pulled his coat tighter, the chill settling into his bones. He thought of the town sleeping just beyond the ridge, the baker rising before dawn, the schoolhouse with its peeling paint, the church bell that still rang every Sunday. They all depended on this harbor. If corruption rooted here, it would seep into every home like seawater through a cracked hull. That was the true danger. Not just guns or drugs, but the slow erosion of trust. And he would not allow it. His thoughts drifted to Caleb again, as they always did. 7 years old, still caught between childhood wonder and the first glimmers of independence. The boy adored him, asked endless questions about the harbor, about the sea, about the badge he wore. Ethan saw in his son's eyes the same restless spark he himself had once carried. Before years of mistakes had dimmed it, he wanted better for Caleb, safer, which was why nights like this mattered. Each vigil was more than a patrol. It was a promise. Every step along these damp planks was his way of saying, "You can sleep, son. I've got this. You don't have to carry it." A sound cut through his reverie, a low clang, sharp against the muffled night. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. The trawler. The noise had come from her deck. He imagined figures moving in the fog, unseen but listening too. For a moment, the world held still, the only movement the slow curl of mist around the pilings. Ethan exhaled slowly, reaching for his radio at last. His thumb hovered over the call button. He would report the suspicious vessel, request backup, and hold position until dawn. That was the protocol, the safe choice. But his gut screamed that something was about to tip, that the harbor itself was leaning toward a storm. He raised the radio to his lips. Dock 12. Possible activity. Stand by. His voice was steady, but beneath it lay the old weight of failure, the iron vow not to repeat it. The fog thickened, swallowing the trawler until only her faint outline remained. Ethan tightened his grip on the radio, eyes locked on the shadowed ship, every muscle coiled. Whatever lingered out there, he would be ready. And though he didn't know it yet, tonight's vigil would test more than his oath to the town. It would test the very bond between a father and his son, between trust and fear, between the past that haunted him and the future he still hoped to protect. The harbor creaked beneath his boots. The night held its breath, and Ethan kept his vigil, unaware that small footsteps at home were already stirring, restless with curiosity, ready to follow him into the dark. The house was quiet, wrapped in the kind of stillness that only comes after a long day when even the walls seem to rest. Moonlight filtered through the curtains in Caleb's small bedroom, casting pale stripes across the quilt pulled up to his chin. He had been tucked in hours ago, kissed goodnight by his father, with the promise that tomorrow, perhaps, he could come down to the docks after school to see the boats. But Caleb was not asleep. He lay on his side, eyes wide open, listening. The floorboards downstairs had creaked long after the house should have settled. Then came the familiar sound of his father's boots, heavy but careful, as if trying not to wake him. Caleb knew those steps. He had spent countless evenings waiting at the window just to see Ethan return from the harbor, badge glinting, shoulders stooped with the weight of the night. Tonight, the sound of those boots moving toward the door had stirred something in him. A tug, gentle but relentless. Curiosity, yes, but also longing. Caleb adored his father. To him, Ethan was larger than life, a man who could command the sea itself if he chose to. Yet, despite the stories whispered in town about Ethan's courage, Caleb mostly knew him as the man who came home tired, who sometimes sat silent at the dinner table, eyes distant. It left Caleb wondering, what did his father see out there in the dark that weighed on him so? What battles did he fight that a boy wasn't allowed to witness? The latch of the front door clicked. Caleb's breath caught. He pushed the quilt aside, his small toes curling against the cool wooden floor. Moving carefully, he crept to the window and peered out. The night lay heavy on the street, lamps glowing faintly through the mist, rolling in from the bay. And there, just visible, was Ethan, his broad frame swallowed by the fog as he walked toward the harbor. Caleb's heart thumped. His father was going without him again. He pressed his forehead to the glass, watching until Ethan disappeared beyond the curve of the street. A quiet ache stirred in his chest. He wanted to be part of that world, to understand the secrets his father carried in silence, to prove in some small way that he wasn't just a child to be shielded, but someone who could walk beside him. The decision came before the thought had even formed. Caleb slipped into his clothes, a worn flannel shirt and jeans with frayed knees, and eased open his door. The hallway groaned softly, and he froze, listening for the steady breathing of the house. Nothing stirred. His father's absence seemed to press down on everything, making the silence even deeper. He tiptoed down the stairs, each step deliberate, holding his breath whenever the wood creaked. The living room lay dim, the lamp by the sofa still glowing faintly, left on as it always was when Ethan went out. Caleb paused by the table, where his father's old cap sat, the fabric faded from years of salt air. Without thinking, he lifted it and placed it on his own head. It sagged over his ears, far too big, but somehow it felt like a shield. The front door loomed before him. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob, not out of fear, but anticipation. Beyond this door was his father's world, the one filled with whispers of danger and mystery. Beyond it, maybe, he would finally understand. The night air rushed against his face as he slipped outside, cool and damp with mist. The quiet street stretched before him, leading toward the faint glow of the harbor lamps. He pulled the cap lower, stuffed his hands into his pockets, and began to walk. For Caleb, the world seemed different at night. Houses that by day looked ordinary now stood like watchful sentinels, their windows dark. Trees whispered in the breeze, their branches creaking like old men telling secrets. Every sound, the scrape of gravel beneath his sneakers, the distant crash of waves, was sharper, more alive. Yet beneath the thrill ran a thread of unease. His father had told him many times that the docks weren't a place for children, especially at night. Bad men do their work in the dark, Ethan had once said, his voice edged with something Caleb didn't fully understand. Still, the boy pressed on, convinced that his father's warnings were born of love, not impossibility. He passed the bakery, shutters drawn tight, the scent of flour lingering faintly in the air. He passed the church, its steeple a shadow against the sky. With each step, the sounds of the sea grew louder, the tang of salt stronger. The harbor was close now. Caleb's imagination painted the scene before he even arrived. Ships rocking in the tide, ropes creaking, lanterns swaying. He pictured his father there, standing tall against the mist, eyes scanning for threats only he could see. The thought filled Caleb with pride and a stubborn need to prove himself worthy of standing at his side. But as the fog thickened, the boy's pace slowed. Shadows moved strangely here, stretching across the ground in ways that made his small heart race. He thought he heard whispers, low and harsh, drifting on the wind. He told himself it was only sailors, only dockhands finishing late work. Still, his stomach knotted. He stopped at the edge of the wharf, where the wood met stone. The harbor stretched out before him, dark water lapping at the pilings. Lanterns swung dimly on a few boats, their light fractured by mist. Somewhere out there, Ethan was keeping watch. Caleb's pulse hammered with a mix of excitement and dread. He took a breath, clutching the too big cap against his head. "I'll be careful," he whispered to himself, as if saying it aloud could make it true. And then he stepped forward, his small figure swallowed by the night that had long belonged to men like his father. Caleb didn't know it yet, but curiosity had set him on a path far more dangerous than he could imagine, one that would draw him into the very heart of his father's vigil, and into the eyes of men who saw children not as sons, but as leverage. The fog shifted. Somewhere, footsteps echoed, and Caleb walked on. The harbor loomed like a sleeping beast, its wooden piers stretching out into black water, lanterns swaying with every breath of the tide. Caleb moved along the dock, his steps small, careful, the oversized cap slipping lower on his brow. His heart raced, but wonder pulled him forward. He wanted to glimpse his father somewhere in the mist, wanted to see what made these nights feel so heavy with secrets. He didn't know he was being watched. From the shadowed deck of the nameless trawler, two men crouched low, their eyes narrowing when they caught sight of the small figure wandering alone through the fog. One spat into the water, the sound sharp in the silence. "A kid," he muttered. "What the hell's a kid doing out here?" The other, taller and meaner in his stillness, smirked. His teeth glinted when the lantern swung. "Doesn't matter. Every stray's an opportunity." They moved like predators, slipping down the gangplank without sound, boots landing solid on the dock. Caleb, lost in his own imaginings, didn't hear them until it was too late. A shape loomed from the mist, then another. He froze, breath caught in his throat. "Out late, aren't you, boy?" The tall one's voice was low, almost kind on the surface, but the edge beneath it made Caleb's skin prickle. Before he could turn, call out, or run, a hand shot forward. Hard, calloused fingers clamped around his wrist with a grip like iron. Caleb yelped, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. The cap slipped from his head, landing with a soft thud on the boards. "Please, let me go." His small voice cracked with fear, echoing faintly across the water. "Quiet." The other man's hand covered his mouth, the smell of tobacco and sweat making Caleb gag. He was dragged back against the trawler's hull, the wood rough and damp against his cheek. His legs kicked wildly, sneakers scraping, but the men only tightened their hold. "Look at him squirm," the tall one whispered with a sneer, "like a fish on a line." The shorter man chuckled darkly, his breath hot against Caleb's ear. Wonder what Daddy would pay to get him back. At that, Caleb's blood turned cold. They knew. Somehow they knew. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, but he bit them back. He remembered his father's words. Bravery doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you keep standing, even when you are. Still, he was only 7, and the world had never felt so cruel. They dragged him toward the gangplank, boots thudding softly against the dock. Caleb struggled, twisting with all his strength, but it was like a fighting stone. The men were rough, practiced. Their whispers carried the ease of men who had done this before. "Careful," one muttered. "If the old man's around, we don't want noise." "He won't see a thing," the tall one replied. "The fog's thick. Tonight's our night." The boy whimpered into the hand that muffled him, his small chest heaving. His mind scrambled, searching for anything, any chance to escape. But the dock stretched empty in both directions, lanterns flickering weakly, no savior in sight. As they hauled him up the gangplank, the trawler seemed to swallow him whole. The boards groaned beneath their weight, chains rattled somewhere in the gloom, and the smell of fish mixed with oil and damp metal clawed at his senses. They pushed him onto the deck, forcing him to his knees. Caleb's gaze darted wildly. Shapes shifted in the fog. More men, broad-shouldered, their eyes glinting with curiosity at the new prize dragged aboard. One laughed, a sound that sent shivers down the boy's spine. "A gift," the tall one announced. "Straight from the dock. You know who he is?" Another man stepped forward, scar running jagged across his cheek. He studied Caleb with unsettling calm, then nodded slowly. "Aye, that's Ward's boy." The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous. Then came the low hum of agreement, the kind that spoke not of pity, but of profit. Caleb's heart pounded so hard it hurt. They knew his father. They would use him. The scarred man crouched, bringing his face close to Caleb's. His eyes were sharp, the kind that saw weakness and fed on it. "Listen, boy," he said softly, almost gently. "You don't cry. You don't scream. You sit quietly, and maybe we don't toss you to the sea. Understand?" Caleb's breath shook as he nodded. The man's hand patted his cheek, but there was no kindness in the gesture, only possession. "Good lad," he murmured. "You'll buy us time." "Your father will walk blind if he thinks your life hangs in the balance." They bound Caleb's wrists with rough rope, the fibers biting into his skin. He clenched his jaw, refusing to cry, though every tug tightened the knot like fire against his flesh. They shoved him against the railing, pressing him to the splintered wood, and lashed him there. The tide slapped angrily below, each wave sounding like a drumbeat of doom. The men returned to their work, their whispers laced with greed and malice. Caleb caught fragments. Shipment. Cover. Ward won't risk it. His body trembled, but he forced himself to stay quiet. Somewhere out there, he believed, his father was near. Somewhere help would come. But as the fog thickened and the men laughed, he realized something chilling. These were not the kind of men who feared the law. They were the kind who thrived in its blind spots, who would not hesitate to use a child as bait. And in that moment, Caleb understood what danger really meant. He lowered his head, whispering the words only he could hear. "Be brave. Stand, even when afraid." His lips quivered, but he kept repeating it, like a prayer woven into the night. The harbor creaked, chains rattled, and somewhere in the distance, a low growl stirred in the fog, unnoticed by the men, but destined to change everything. The night pressed close around the harbor, a thick shroud of fog rolling low across the piers. For most men, the mist was a wall. For Ares, it was a canvas. Every sound etched itself sharper. Every scent carried farther. Every ripple of air painting a picture more vivid than sight alone. He moved with his handler along the edge of Dock 10, paws silent against the weathered planks. His vest, black, snug, marked boldly with the words, "Police K9, hugged his frame. Muscles rippled beneath his coat with each stride, the sheen of black and tan fur broken by faint scars hidden in the shadows of his flank. They weren't just marks of survival. They were stories carved into his body, training fields, bite sleeves, shattered glass, the teeth of men who had tried to fight him off. Ares carried them all without complaint, the way only a dog could. To those who didn't know him, he was a weapon, sharp, controlled, unleashed only on command. But those who worked beside him understood there was more beneath that disciplined surface. His gaze held intelligence, his stance loyalty, his heart an unwavering bond to the work and the people he was sworn to protect. Tonight, though, something in his posture was different. His ears pricked sharply, head turning as if catching a signal only he could hear. His handler, Officer Daniels, felt the tension through the leash. He slowed, eyes narrowing at the dog's sudden stillness. "What is it, boy?" Daniels murmured, voice barely louder than the fog-swelled tide. Ares didn't move. He stood rigid, nose lifted, chest expanding as he drew the night into his lungs. Scents layered themselves like pages of a book. Diesel from the trawlers, salt from the sea, fish rotting in crates stacked nearby. But beneath it, something faint, out of place. Smoke, sweat, and sharper still, the sour tang of fear. His tail stiffened, body coiled like a drawn bow. A low vibration began in his chest, not yet a growl, but a warning his handler knew well. Daniels adjusted his grip. He had learned years ago that Ares's instincts were rarely wrong. "Easy," he whispered, though the words were more for himself than the dog. They moved forward again, slower now. The harbor's usual sounds, the clink of loose chains, the lap of water, felt muted, smothered by something unseen. Ares walked half a step ahead, leash taut, each paw placed with purpose. His amber eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, scanning as if expecting figures to materialize at any moment. Daniels stole a glance at him, remembering their first meeting. Ares had not been the eager pup others were. He had been distant, difficult, his energy coiled too tightly, his trust slow to earn. Some said he was too much of a dog, too sharp for the line of duty. But over time, Daniels had seen what others missed. The stubborn streak was not defiance, but focus. The distance was not coldness, but patience. Once Ares gave his loyalty, it was absolute. And tonight, that loyalty felt razor-edged. They paused near Dock 12. The fog curled thicker here, swallowing even the lantern light. Ares lowered his head, sniffing intently at the ground near the piling. His body language shifted, alert, urgent, ears swiveling toward the faint creak of a gangplank in the distance. Daniels followed his gaze but saw only shadows. "You've got something," he murmured. His pulse quickened, old instincts stirring. Ares's tail flicked once, stiff, before freezing again. He inhaled, chest rising deep, and the faintest rumble escaped his throat. Not aggression, not yet, just the sound of certainty. Something was wrong. Daniels trusted that sound more than any report on his desk. He crouched, running his hand briefly along Ares's back, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath fur and muscle. The contact steadied him. "All right, partner, lead the way." The shepherd surged forward, pulling slightly against the leash, steps quickening. He wasn't reckless, he never was, but there was urgency in the way he moved now, a conviction that danger was close. His nose dipped toward the ground, then lifted again, sampling the air. His whole frame vibrated with purpose. They wove between stacked crates and abandoned nets. The harbor at night could play tricks, every rope looking like a snake, every shadow a man. But Ares never flinched. He was trained to cut through deception, to find what others could not. Daniel's hand hovered near his holster, the other gripping the leash tight. He could feel the tension in his partner, like a string pulled taut, seconds from snapping. He tried to listen past the rush of his own pulse, but the fog offered nothing except silence. Then Ares stopped dead. His body became stone, head angled toward the trawler tied at Dock 12, the one Ethan Ward had been watching from the other end of the pier. Ares's ears locked forward, and a low, unmistakable growl curled from his chest. Daniel stiffened. He couldn't see anyone, but he didn't need to. He had learned long ago, if Ares growled, it wasn't in the shadows. "Something's there," Daniels whispered, breath clouding in the cold air. Ares's gaze never wavered. The fog shifted, carrying with it a trace that struck him harder than any gunshot. The scent of youth, sharp with fear. It was fragile, desperate, unlike the hardened stench of the men he was trained to track. This was different. This was a child. His growl deepened, throat vibrating with urgency. Daniels tightened his grip, following the line of his partner's stare. Still, nothing but mist and the faint outline of a ship. But Ares knew. He didn't need sight to see. Somewhere on that vessel, someone small, someone afraid, was waiting. And for the first time in months, Daniels felt a chill crawl his spine. Not from the fog, but from the certainty that tonight's patrol was no ordinary night. Ares's instincts had sharpened to a blade's edge. Something was about to break open in the darkness, and the German shepherd stood ready, not as a weapon, but as the only shield that child would have. The fog thickened around the docks until even the lanterns seemed to drown in it, their light dissolving into pale halos that barely touched the ground. Officer Daniels shifted uneasily, his boots echoing faintly on the slick planks. The harbor was always a place of unease at night, but tonight felt different. It felt watchful. At his side, Ares stopped. The shepherd froze so suddenly that Daniels nearly stumbled from the pull of the leash. Every line of the dog's body sharpened, ears thrust forward, tail stiff, head tilted slightly upward. His nostrils flared, pulling the night in with deep, deliberate breaths. Daniels knew that posture. It wasn't a casual interest. It was a revelation. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, voice low, careful not to cut through the fragile silence. Ares did not move. His chest rose and fell slowly, rhythmically, as though he were piecing together a puzzle invisible to human eyes. The salt of the sea lay thick, the stench of diesel heavy, the fish crates pungent. But beneath those familiar layers was something else, a note so sharp it pierced everything else. Fear. It clung to the mist like smoke, faint but undeniable. Ares's body stiffened further, a tremor rippling down his flank. He inhaled again, deeper this time, and the scent told its story clearer. It wasn't the rough, sour fear of grown men caught in crime. This was smaller, thinner, tinged with innocence, fresh sweat, trembling skin, a child's fear. Caleb. Though Ares had never shared a home with the boy, he knew his scent, carried on his father's clothes, lingering on Ethan's boots, brushed onto his uniform jacket after evenings when Caleb had clung to him. Dogs catalogued such things, memories etched not in photographs, but in smells. To Ares, Caleb was laughter tangled with soap and the faint trace of wood chips from the schoolyard. Tonight, that familiar imprint was distorted, wrapped in salt water and terror. Ares's lips curled, not in anger, but in a soundless snarl of recognition. Something was wrong. Daniels crouched, trying to follow his partner's gaze into the fog. "Talk to me," he muttered, though he knew Ares already was. The dog's rigid stance was as clear as words. Someone was out there. Someone small. Someone in danger. The shepherd leaned forward against the leash, muscles quivering with restraint. His tail gave one stiff lash before freezing again. He wanted to move, to follow, to cut through the mist and find the source of that fragile scent before it shattered completely. Daniels's throat went dry. He trusted Ares more than any flashlight, more than his own senses, dulled by darkness. He loosened his grip slightly, signaling permission without a word. Ares surged a step forward, nose brushing low along the planks, then lifting sharply into the air again. His movements were fluid, precise, guided not by sight, but by the map of scent unraveling before him. The trail was fresh, heartbreakingly so. The boy had passed through only minutes ago. The fog hadn't stolen him yet. Daniels followed close, pulse quickening. He thought of all the nights he had doubted himself, wondered if this dog was truly as gifted as the trainers said. Those doubts vanished now. Ares was a compass, and fear itself was his north. The shepherd stopped again, sudden and absolute. His body lowered slightly, as if bracing. The scent was stronger here, saturated into the wood and air. Caleb had been near, very near, and not alone. Mixed with the boy's scent was the acrid tang of tobacco, thick with sweat and oil, harsher than the sea's salt. Adult men, several of them. Their odor carried a different edge, predatory, coarse, laced with greed. Ares's ears flattened for a heartbeat, his body trembling with restrained urgency. He turned his head slightly toward Daniels, eyes catching what little light the lanterns offered. In that gaze was no doubt only a plea. We must move. Daniels felt his chest tighten. He couldn't see the boy, couldn't hear him, but the dog's certainty pierced through the fog like a flare. Somewhere ahead, a child was tied into the nets of men who saw him as leverage. Ares's growl began low, a vibration that reverberated against the leash in Daniels's hand. It was not reckless noise, it was a promise. He had found the thread, and he would not let it go. Daniels swallowed hard. "Easy, partner," he whispered, though his own voice shook. "We'll get him. Lead on." The shepherd pressed forward again, each stride deliberate, nose quivering, mapping the invisible. His tail was stiff, his body an arrow drawn against a bowstring. The fear in Caleb's scent tugged at him with merciless force. Dogs could not reason in human words, but Ares knew this much. Fear this strong meant the child was close to breaking, and he would not let that happen. As they edged closer to Dock 12, the fog shifted, revealing for just an instant the shadow of the trawler. Ares's growl deepened, chest rumbling like distant thunder. His hackles rose, every hair bristling with the certainty of danger. Daniels tightened his grip on the leash, heart pounding. He could almost see it now, too. The outlines of men, where the fog thickened unnaturally, the faint gleam of metal at a hip. The scent of fear had led them to the edge of something they could not yet name, but Ares was unflinching. To Daniels, the dog was more than a partner in that moment. He was a bridge, a living thread between unseen danger and the fragile hope that a child could still be saved. Humans stumbled blind in the dark, but Ares carried light in his nose, in his instincts, in the unbreakable loyalty that pulled him forward. The shepherd's growl faded into silence as he crouched low, body rigid, nose flaring. His eyes fixed on the trawler, where the scent was strongest, where the fear bled thickest. And in that stillness, Daniels finally understood. They weren't just chasing smugglers tonight. They were racing against the tide of terror itself. Ares shifted once more, a sharp inhale rattling through him. Then, with the tension of a storm about to break, he waited, ready to surge, ready to shield, ready to prove that between danger and salvation, there was only one line left, and he would hold it. The mist rolled heavier now, swallowing lantern light until even the closest outlines of the harbor seemed like half-remembered shapes. The air had that thick, metallic weight before storms, though no thunderclouds hovered above. It was the storm of men, not weather, that waited here. Ethan Ward stood just beyond Dock 12, one hand steady on the railing, the other resting near the grip of his sidearm. His radio buzzed softly, static, lacing the quiet. Other officers were moving into position, their boots muffled on wet planks, their voices low murmurs through the calm. Unit 3 in place. North end secure. Ready on your call, Ward. Ethan's jaw flexed. He could feel it in his bones, the tension winding tighter, second by second. The nameless trawler sat tethered to the dock like some patient predator, ropes creaking with the rhythm of the tide. He had watched enough ships to know when one held cargo and when one held secrets. This one breathed secrets. Behind him, Officer Daniels crouched with Ares at his side. The shepherd was a statue of focus, ears thrust forward, nose still quivering with sense. Only he could unravel. His earlier growl had faded into silence, but the rigid set of his shoulders told Ethan more than words. The dog had found something. "Ward," Daniels whispered, his face tense beneath the dim glow. "He's keyed up. More than usual. There's something out there." Ethan gave a curt nod. He trusted the dog's instincts as much as his own. Still, procedure was procedure. They would box the smugglers in, move quietly, force surrender if possible. Violence was a last resort, on paper. In truth, these docks rarely gave second chances. The mist thickened again, curling around the officers like grasping fingers. Ethan lifted his radio. "All units hold position. Wait for my signal." He took a slow breath. The stakes always pressed on him in moments like this. The balance between catching men who poisoned the town and keeping his team alive. Yet tonight, the weight pressed harder. His mind flickered, unbidden, to Caleb. Tucked in bed, he hoped, dreaming, safe. He shoved the thought down, but the unease lingered. Unseen to him, only yards away, his son sat bound to the trawler's railing, the rope biting his wrists, his small body trembling with cold and terror. The officers closed in with silent precision, not knowing every step they took, pressed closer to both salvation and danger. Ethan raised a hand, signaling forward movement. Shadows detached themselves from the fog, officers advancing, weapons ready, eyes sharp. Boots tapped softly against soaked boards. The creak of gear, the whisper of breath, the metallic click of safeties released. Ares moved half a pace ahead of Daniels, each paw silent, tail stiff, body taut as a bowstring. His nose flicked toward the trawler, pulling harder on the leash. Daniels followed, whispering under his breath, "Steady, boy. Just a little longer." The harbor answered with its own sounds, the groan of hulls, the slap of waves, the distant clang of chains. Each noise seemed louder, harsher, as though the night itself was warning them away. The officers moved regardless, threading the line between caution and inevitability. From the shadows of the trawler, smugglers watched. Their eyes tracked the silhouettes approaching, their fingers tightening on rifles hidden just beyond the railing. They had heard the soft crunch of boots, seen lantern light glint against steel badges, and near their feet, Caleb whimpered before biting his lip to silence it. The tall man with the scar pressed a hand to his shoulder, whispering harshly, "Quiet, boy, or the sea will swallow you." His words were low, but the promise in them was real. Caleb's heart pounded, chest heaving against the ropes. On the dock, Ethan lifted a hand once more. His men froze, awaiting the order. His eyes locked on the trawler's shape, vague through fog, its deck a smudge of shadow. Something shifted there, a scrape of boot, a faint murmur carried by the mist. He narrowed his gaze. "Confirm movement," one officer whispered into the radio. "Starboard side." Ethan's jaw clenched. He could almost feel the night balancing on a knife's edge. Move too soon, and they risked scattering into chaos. Move too late, and whatever was hidden might slip into the sea forever. Beside him, Ares bristled. His chest expanded with a deep inhale, then rumbled with a low growl. Daniels tightened his hold, heart racing. He had seen the dog alert to guns, knives, explosives, but never with this edge, this urgency. Ares was not just signaling danger. He was signaling someone was in peril now. Daniels leaned closer to Ethan. "He smells something. Not cargo. Not weapons. Something else." Ethan's eyes flicked toward him, the words piercing through his resolve. Something else. For a brief second, he thought of Caleb again, of his boy's face pressed against the window the night before, asking why he couldn't come along. He shoved the thought aside. It was impossible. Caleb was safe at home. He gave the signal. Officers advanced in formation, shadows fanning out along the dock. The mist wrapped tighter, shrouding the lines between hunter and hunted. Inside the trawler, men gripped their weapons, ready to burst from hiding. And bound against the railing, Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, whispering his father's words under his breath. Bravery doesn't mean no fear. It means standing while afraid. Every detail tightened into one fragile moment. The officer's boots creaked closer. The smuggler's fingers curled harder around triggers. The boy's breath came in shallow gasps, and the dog stood trembling with instinct, a bridge between salvation and disaster, waiting for the storm to break. The ropes bit into Caleb's wrists until his skin burned. Each knot had been pulled cruelly tight, digging deeper with every tremor of his small body. He sat pressed against the cold railing of the trawler, wood splintering against his back, the sea slamming the hull beneath him in a rhythm that felt like a warning. The tide was restless tonight. Waves struck with hollow booms, sending shivers through the deck that rattled into Caleb's bones. Every time the boat groaned, he imagined it breaking loose, imagined himself slipping into the black water below with his arms bound, sinking before he could even cry out. The thought made his throat ache, but he bit down hard on his lip, refusing to let the tears fall. He remembered his father's words. Bravery doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you keep standing, even when you are. But how could a 7-year-old stand when he was tied down? His chest rose and fell quickly, shallow breaths fogging the damp air around his face. His mind kept tumbling back to his room, to the quilt he had left behind, to the safe hum of the house when his father's footsteps faded into the night. He had thought following Ethan was an adventure, that he would see the world his father walked, that maybe, just maybe, he would understand why those nights weighed on him so. Now he understood only this. Danger was not a story whispered in the safety of home. It was hands that smelled of tobacco crushing against his mouth, ropes scratching raw at his skin, voices around him laced with greed. He shifted slightly, testing the rope. The fibers scratched deep, leaving angry marks across his wrists. It was useless. The men had tied him as though he were cargo, not a boy. From the far side of the deck, the smugglers muttered to one another. Caleb caught fragments. Ward. Bargain. Leverage. His father's name echoed like a stone dropped into his stomach. They knew. They knew he was Ethan Ward's son, and that meant they wouldn't let him go easily. One of the men passed close by, his boots heavy, his shadow looming. Caleb pressed back against the railing, trying to shrink into it. The man glanced down, a cruel grin pulling at his lips. "Not so tough now, are you?" His voice was low, sharp with mockery. "Best sit still, boy. Crying won't do you no good out here." Caleb swallowed hard, his lips trembling. He wanted to scream, to call for his father, but the sound stuck in his throat like a stone. Instead, he closed his eyes, willing himself to disappear, to vanish into the fog like the lanterns had. But the smell of the sea wouldn't let him forget where he was. Salt, fish, oil, all of it clung to the air, heavy and unkind. Each wave that struck the hull sent cold spray misting his face, mingling with the tears he tried to hold back. He thought of his father again, the way Ethan would crouch down to meet his eyes, the way his hand rested heavy but warm on his shoulder. He tried to imagine him here now, stepping onto the deck with that calm strength that never wavered. Caleb clung to that image, whispering to himself, "He'll come. Dad will come." But the whispers of the men made it harder to believe. "What if the cops move in fast?" one muttered. "Then we use the boy. Ward won't risk his own. And if he does?" A pause. Then the chilling reply. "Then the sea gets one more secret." Caleb's stomach twisted. He squeezed his eyes tighter, biting back the sob that threatened to escape. He couldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing him cry. The deck creaked beneath shifting boots. Lantern lights swung, casting long, jagged shadows across the boy's small frame. He stared down at the planks, his breath shaking, his lips moving silently. Bravery doesn't mean no fear. Stand while afraid. He repeated it like a prayer, clutching the words the way his wrists longed to clutch freedom. Somewhere beyond the trawler, muffled by the mist, he thought he heard movement. Boots on planks, faint, distant. His heart leapt, but he dared not react. If the men saw, they would know. He lifted his head slightly, eyes wide, straining against the dark. He couldn't see anyone, but he felt something. Like the night itself had shifted, like the air carried promise alongside the salt. His small body trembled, hope flickering like a lantern in a storm. But then the scarred man crouched before him, blocking his view, his face close enough that Caleb smelled the sour stench of his breath. "You sit quiet, boy," the man whispered. "One sound, and we'll make sure you never see your old man again." His hand patted Caleb's cheek with mock gentleness, leaving behind the sting of ownership. Caleb's chest heaved. He wanted to recoil, to spit, to scream, but he stayed still. Silent, afraid, yes, but standing in the only way he could. The tide slammed harder beneath them, as if echoing the storm building above. The trawler swayed, ropes groaning, chains clattering. Caleb closed his eyes and imagined Aries, the police dog his father had once let him pet after training. The shepherd's eyes had been steady, his body strong, his presence quiet but sure. Caleb wished with everything in him that the dog was here now, standing between him and the darkness. The night pressed tighter. The smugglers whispered sharper, and Caleb's heart hammered like a drum. Somewhere, he believed, someone was coming. Somewhere in the fog, salvation stirred. But for now, all he had was the creak of wood, the roar of waves, the bite of rope, and a promise whispered through trembling lips: stand while afraid. The trawler swayed under the pull of the tide, its hull creaking as though the ship itself disapproved of what it carried. Lantern light flickered across the deck, swinging with every movement of the sea. Bound to the railing, Caleb sat motionless, his wrists raw from the ropes, his eyes fixed on the planks beneath him. He listened, though, because listening was all he could do, and what he heard chilled him more than the salt wind that numbed his skin. The smugglers were arguing. At first, their voices were low, sharp whispers that sliced through the fog, but as tempers flared, they rose louder, harder, carrying over the crash of waves. "I say we hold him," one man growled, his voice guttural, heavy with the rasp of tobacco. "He's Ward's brat. That badge-wearing bastard will crawl on his knees if we've got the boy." "We name the price. He pays it." A second voice shot back, tense and sharp. "You're a fool. Ward's not the type to fold. He'll bring the whole damn precinct down on us. Cops don't negotiate with leverage. They storm. And when they storm, we'll be the ones chained in the dirt." The tall one, the one who had first grabbed Caleb, snorted. "Better to chain the kid than chain ourselves. He's a bargaining chip, and chips buy time." Another voice, quieter but colder, cut through. The scarred man. Caleb recognized him by the weight in his tone, steady and merciless. "Time for what? You think Ward won't risk a firefight if his boy's tied to us? No, he'll risk it. Because men like him always believe they're faster, stronger, smarter. And when the bullets fly, who do you think they'll hit first?" He tilted his head toward Caleb. "The kid. One stray shot, and he's gone." The words hit Caleb like a wave slamming his chest. He swallowed hard, trying not to show the tremor that ran through him. His lips moved silently, repeating his father's words. "Stand while afraid." The argument escalated. Boots stamped against the deck as men paced, their frustrations spilling into gestures and curses. The air grew thick, not just with fog, but with fear. Theirs, not just his. "We can't keep him," one shouted. "Every second he's here, the rope's tighter around our own necks." "Let him go," another barked back. "Are you mad? He's Ward's blood. He's worth more than anything we've hauled in." The scarred man's patience snapped. He slammed his fist against the railing, the sound cracking like thunder. "Listen to yourselves. You think the cops care about a boy once the bullets fly? They'll use him as an excuse to hit harder. We should have tossed him the second we grabbed him." Caleb flinched, pressing himself tighter against the wood. The thought of being thrown into the black water made his breath catch. But he forced himself not to cry. Not in front of them. Not when every tear would feed their cruelty. The shorter man spat on the deck, his voice laced with greed. "No, he's the ticket. Ward will come crawling. And when he does, we'll make our move." "You're dreaming," the scarred man snapped. "Dreaming with a rope already around your neck." The group fractured into shouts, half siding with Ransom, half with silence. Their words overlapped, a storm of anger and desperation. "Worth more alive slows us down. One bullet ends this, think of the payout." Caleb's chest tightened as the men's voices rose. He could see it in their eyes when they turned toward each other. Mistrust. Greed pulling them one way, fear dragging them another. These men weren't united. They were breaking apart, their loyalty fraying as fast as the ropes that bound him dug deeper into his skin. For a flicker of a moment, Caleb wondered if that fracture could save him. Men too busy fighting each other might not notice the boy quietly slipping away. But the rope bit harder when he tested it again, the fibers unyielding, his small wrists too raw. The scarred man finally barked loud enough to silence them. Enough. We decide now. Ransom or silence. No more of this squabbling. He pointed a finger at Caleb, his eyes like shards of flint. That boy is either a prize or a liability. And either way, he doesn't walk off this boat unless we choose it. Caleb's stomach twisted. He pressed his forehead against the cold railing, fighting the wave of panic that threatened to break him. The men's footsteps echoed around him, circling like wolves, debating who would take the first bite. In the mist beyond, faint sounds drifted. Boots on planks, muffled orders whispered through radios. But the smugglers didn't hear. Or perhaps they were too consumed by their own quarrel to care. One man muttered, "Ward's close. I can feel it. If he's here, so's the rest. Then we use the boy, or we sink him and vanish." Their voices tangled again, a snarl of desperation. Caleb closed his eyes tight. He thought of home, of the smell of his father's jacket when he hugged him, of the warmth of his mother's photograph by his bed. He thought of Ares, the shepherd, with eyes that seemed to understand without words. He whispered to himself, so softly no one heard, "Please find me." The deck rocked with another wave. The ropes groaned, and the smugglers' argument carved itself deeper into the night, splitting them into men ruled by greed and men ruled by fear. But in that fracture lay something dangerous, unpredictability. For a boy tied to the railing, unpredictability meant every heartbeat could bring salvation, or the final push into the sea. The argument faded into murmurs, then into a heavy silence, broken only by the sea's endless pounding against the hull. Lanterns swung on their hooks, throwing restless shadows across the deck. The smugglers moved away, splitting into uneasy corners, their voices lowered but still edged with distrust. For the moment, Caleb was left alone, still bound, still trembling, still fighting the ropes that held him to the railing. His wrists ached. The fibers had rubbed his skin raw, each shift carving a deeper sting. He tried to wiggle his hands free, but the knots were tight, cruelly knotted by men who knew what it meant to restrain. Every tug left him weaker. The boy slumped back against the railing, eyes stinging. He had been strong as long as he could, but the weight of it pressed too hard now. The creak of the boat, the crash of the waves, the voices of men who saw him as nothing more than a bargaining chip. Fear coiled inside him, heavy and suffocating. A sob rose in his throat, desperate to escape. He bit down on it, jaw clenching, until the taste of salt filled his mouth. He didn't want them to hear. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing they had broken him. He tilted his head back, staring up into the fog. The sky was invisible here, swallowed whole, but he imagined stars hidden beyond the mist. He imagined their glow spilling down like his mother used to describe in bedtime stories. "The stars don't go away when the clouds come," she had told him once. "They're just waiting, watching, until you can see them again." His chest shook, and his lips moved with a whisper so faint it barely stirred the air. "Please, help me." It wasn't just a prayer to God, though he hoped God was listening. It was a prayer to his father, too, out there somewhere in the same mist, searching, and maybe, just maybe, to the shepherd he had met once before, the one with steady eyes who had made him feel safe. Bravery doesn't mean no fear. The words rose from memory, sharp as if his father were kneeling beside him, saying them again. Ethan had told him that after his first day of school, when Caleb had stood frozen at the doorway, afraid to step inside, his father had crouched low, put a hand on his shoulder, and whispered, "It means standing while afraid." Caleb repeated it now, lips moving silently, over and over, like a rhythm, like a heartbeat. Standing while afraid. He tried to straighten, pressing his back against the railing, lifting his chin, though his body trembled. He was afraid, terrified, but he could still stand. Even tied, even small, even voiceless against the sea, he could hold himself upright. The smuggler's words lingered in his ears. The sea gets one more secret. He closed his eyes against them, against their cruelty, and forced himself to imagine instead his father's face, calm, steady, unyielding. He pictured Ethan walking onto the deck, lantern light cutting through the fog, his voice firm, his arms ready. That image steadied him. He whispered again, barely audible, "Dad's coming." The night air pressed damp and cold against his skin. The smell of fish and diesel made his stomach churn, but beneath it all, he swore he caught something else, faint, far, but real. A whiff of a dog, fur and leather, and the sharp scent of training fields. Hope flickered. He leaned forward slightly, testing the ropes again, not to escape this time, but to feel alive, to remind himself he still could. The sea boomed against the hull, rattling the deck, sending spray across his cheeks. Caleb let it wash over him, closing his eyes as if baptizing himself in its salt. He was afraid, yes, but he was not gone. He was here, standing while afraid, whispering his prayer into the night. He thought of stars again, waiting above the mist. He thought of his father's strong hand, his mother's voice, the shepherd's amber eyes. He thought of everything beyond this fear that was worth holding on to. The boy's lips trembled, but his voice grew steadier as he whispered, "I'm still here. I'm not letting go." For a child tied to a railing, it wasn't defiance that mattered most. It was resilience. And in that quiet, in that prayer spoken only to the fog and the tide, Caleb found his strength. He bowed his head, the ropes still biting, the danger still close. But inside him, something had shifted. He would endure this night. And somewhere in the mist, unseen but closing in, a shepherd lowered his nose to the wind and caught the same scent of salt and terror, and the faint, steady heartbeat of a boy who had chosen to stand, even while afraid. The harbor was a breath away from breaking. Mist hung heavy over Dock 12, thick enough to blur shapes into shifting shadows. Officers moved like phantoms, their boots muffled against wet planks, their voices kept to whispers over the radio. Ethan Ward raised his hand, signaling them forward, his own heartbeat pounding like a war drum. He could feel it, the moment before chaos, when silence carried the weight of something ready to snap. On the trawler, the smugglers moved restlessly. Lantern light threw jagged arcs across their faces, sharp with greed, sharper still with fear. They had argued themselves into exhaustion, but the boy lashed to the railing was proof of their desperation. Caleb sat small against the splintered wood, every muscle trembling, his lips moving in a silent prayer. He could hear it too, the change in the air, the closing of a circle. Ares was the first to break the stillness. The shepherd stood rigid at Daniel's side, body trembling with coiled energy. His ears thrust forward, nose lifted, chest expanding with a low, guttural growl. He had caught something. Movement, intent, the electric charge of danger about to spark. Daniel's grip tightened on the leash. "Steady, boy," he whispered, though his own pulse leapt. He saw it in Ares's stance. The dog wasn't warning anymore. He was ready. Then it came. A crack split the night. Sharp, brutal, deafening. A gunshot. For an instant, everything froze. The sound echoed across the docks, bouncing off steel and wood, slicing through the fog like lightning through clouds. Then, the harbor erupted. More shots followed in quick succession, each one shattering the fragile silence. Bullets tore into the crates stacked on the dock, splintering wood, sending fragments flying. Sparks leapt as rounds ricocheted off steel hulls, the sharp tang of gunpowder mixing with salt air. Officers dove for cover, shouting commands that dissolved into the roar of gunfire. "Take cover!" Ethan barked, his voice raw. He dropped behind a stack of crates, drawing his weapon, eyes locked on the trawler. His chest seized as he thought, not of the smugglers, but of the boy tied to that railing. His boy. On the deck, Caleb flinched with every shot, the ropes cutting deeper as he pressed back against the railing. Splinters rained around him, one shard slicing across his cheek. He clenched his jaw, refusing to scream, though his body shook so violently it rattled the wood behind him. The lantern swung wildly above, shadows jerking like monsters across the planks. The smugglers fired blindly into the fog, their shouts tangled with panic. "They're here! Keep 'em back!" one roared. Another cursed as his rifle jammed, the sound drowned in the chaos. They ducked behind barrels and crates, their faces pale, their eyes darting to the boy they had bound, as if he were both shield and curse. Ethan fired back, rounds cracking through the mist. His men answered from all sides, muzzle flashes flaring like lightning, each burst revealing fragments of the storm. The glint of a rifle barrel, the curl of smoke, the blur of men ducking and rising. The dock became a battlefield carved from shadow and fire. Through it all, Ares surged forward, muscles taut against the leash. Daniels held tight, teeth gritted, but the shepherd strained, nose locked on the trawler, ears deaf to everything except the heartbeat of the boy he knew was there. Gunfire meant nothing to him. He had been trained for this, tempered by it. But tonight, instinct ran deeper than training. Tonight, it was not just duty, it was a rescue. "Hold," Daniels hissed, dragging him back a step, but Ares braced hard, claws scraping wood. His growl grew louder, vibrating through the fog like thunder. He wanted to move, to cut through the bullets, to shield the child before the night tore him apart. On the deck, Caleb's silent prayer grew faster, desperate now. "Stand while afraid, stand while afraid." He bit into the words like lifelines, eyes squeezed shut as bullets sparked against metal only feet away. The sound was overwhelming, a storm he couldn't escape. Yet still he whispered, refusing to break, even as the world around him did. The officers pushed closer, trading fire. Ethan moved with them, but his focus narrowed to the trawler's outline. He imagined his son there, bound, terrified, caught in the crossfire. Rage and fear churned in his chest until his vision burned with it. "Suppressing fire," one officer shouted. Bullets raked the side of the trawler, chewing into wood, forcing smugglers down. But still they fired back, desperate, reckless. A round struck the dock inches from Ethan's arm, splinters slicing across his sleeve. He flinched, but held steady, returning fire with a precision born of fury. The harbor groaned under the weight of it all, metal shrieking, wood splintering, men shouting, a dog straining, and somewhere in the center of it, a boy prayed to the night that his father would come. The first shot had broken the silence. Now the night itself was breaking apart. Gunfire tore the night apart. The docks roared with chaos, bullets sparking off steel hulls, crates exploding into splinters, the shouts of officers and smugglers tangled in the thick choke of fog. The trawler rocked in the tide, its deck lit in flashes of muzzle fire, each burst revealing Caleb's small figure lashed to the railing. His face was pale, eyes wide, lips moving with silent prayers. Ares saw him. The shepherd's body went taut, every instinct sharpening to a single point. Through the gunpowder haze, through the salt and oil of the harbor, he smelled the boy's fear, sharp, bitter, human. It cut through everything else. The leash in Daniel's hand jerked as Ares surged forward, claws scraping against the slick planks. "Hold!" Daniel shouted, straining against him. But Ares was no longer listening. This wasn't training. This wasn't obedience to a command barked through static. This was instinct, older and deeper than drills. The child was in danger, and no force on earth could root Ares to the dock. Another volley of gunfire cracked overhead, sparks raining as bullets glanced off a steel crane. Officers ducked for cover, but Ares pressed forward, chest expanding with a growl that rolled like thunder. His eyes locked on the trawler's deck, on the boy, on salvation. And then he leapt. The leash slipped from Daniel's grasp, tearing skin from his palm, as the shepherd hurled himself into the air. For a heartbeat, he was a dark shape, cutting through fog, body stretched, muscles straining. Gunfire lit the night, glinting off the vest strapped to his back. Police K9, flashing white in staccato bursts. His jaws opened, teeth gleaming, not in rage, but in the fearless promise of defense. He hit the trawler's deck with the weight of a thunderclap. Wood groaned under the impact as claws dug deep for purchase. The force sent one smuggler staggering backward, rifle clattering from his grip. Ares did not pause. He drove forward in a blur of fur and fury, jaws clamping around the man's arm before he could recover. The smuggler screamed, twisting, trying to wrench free, but the shepherd's teeth locked with bone-deep precision. He had been trained to disable, not destroy. But tonight, the line between the two blurred. Another man swung the butt of his rifle toward Ares. The shepherd released his first target with a whip-quick motion, pivoting, jaws snapping on the weapon instead. The wood cracked under his bite, shards flying. The man stumbled back, eyes wide with shock, as the dog's growl rattled the very planks beneath them. Gunfire cracked again. Bullets tore across the deck, ricocheting off steel fittings. Sparks burst inches from Ares's flank. He didn't flinch. He planted himself between Caleb and the storm, body low, teeth bared, eyes burning. Caleb gasped, tears spilling down his cheeks. For the first time since the ropes had bound him, hope surged. "Ares," he whispered, voice breaking. His small body leaned forward, straining against the rope. The shepherd's ears flicked at the sound, his growl deepening into something primal. "I hear you. I am here." One of the smugglers cursed, raising his pistol. He aimed squarely at the boy. Ares moved before the man's finger could tighten. He lunged, body coiling, slamming into the smuggler's chest. The pistol fired wild into the sky, the shot echoing into the fog. They hit the deck hard, the man thrashing beneath the shepherd's weight, but Ares was relentless. His teeth sank into fabric, his claws pinned flesh, his growl drowning the man's cries. Ethan saw the blur through the mist, his dog, his partner on the deck. Relief and terror collided in his chest. "Cover him," he bellowed. His men answered with suppressing fire, bullets streaking across the fog to force smugglers down. Ares released the man with a final shove and spun back toward Caleb. Bullets struck the railing nearby, splintering wood, showering the boy with fragments. Caleb flinched, but Ares pressed closer, shielding him with his body. He lowered his head near Caleb's bound wrists, his hot breath mingling with the salt air. The boy sobbed softly, pressing his forehead into the shepherd's fur. The ropes held fast, but for the first time, Caleb did not feel alone. The smugglers regrouped, their fury mounting. "Shoot the mutt!" one snarled, lifting his rifle. But Ares's courage was untouchable. He rose to meet them, chest squared, teeth glinting in the flickering light. He barked, one explosive, thunderous sound that cut through gunfire and fog alike. It was not the bark of warning, but of war. Bullets streaked again, ricocheting off steel, hissing past his ears. Still, he stood, defiant, immovable, the living shield between innocence and ruin. To Caleb, the shepherd was more than a dog at that moment. He was a wall, a storm, a savior carved from muscle and loyalty. Heroes, Caleb realized through trembling breaths, did not always wear capes. Sometimes they came with fur matted by rain, with eyes that never blinked from danger, with courage no bullet could pierce. And as Ares braced for the next volley, his body taut, his gaze unwavering, the boy's silent prayer found its answer. The trawler's deck had become a storm of chaos, gunfire rattling like thunder, sparks skittering from steel fittings, the tide slamming against the hull in restless fury. The lantern above swung madly in the fog, throwing jagged shadows over men shouting, ducking, and firing into the mist. And in the middle of it all, small and trembling, was Caleb. He was lashed to the railing, splinters cutting into his back, the ropes biting into his wrists. Bullets struck close, chewing holes into the wood just inches from his face. Each impact made him flinch so hard the fibers burned deeper into his skin. His heart thundered in his ears, drowning out the men's curses. The boy pressed his eyes shut, whispering his prayer. "Stand while afraid, stand while afraid." Then he felt it. A heavy, solid warmth pressed against him, blocking the sting of flying fragments. Caleb opened his eyes and saw a blur of black and tan fur, muscles taut beneath the glinting vest marked Police K9. Ares. The shepherd had leapt onto the deck and planted himself in front of the boy, a living shield against the storm. Gunfire cracked again. Bullets sparked as they struck the railing and ricocheted off metal fittings. Ares did not move. His body curved protectively, his stance wide, his chest thrust forward to take the brunt of whatever came. His ears pinned back, his eyes blazed with ferocity, but his presence against the boy was steady, grounding, almost tender. Caleb gasped, a sob catching in his throat. He buried his face into the dog's thick fur, clinging with bound wrists, as if he could disappear into that living wall. The shepherd smelled of earth and leather and salt, but beneath it all was something stronger, safety. For the first time since he had been dragged onto the boat, Caleb's tears flowed freely, soaking into the fur that had come between him and death. Ares growled low, the sound vibrating through his chest and into the boy's cheek. It wasn't a growl of warning now. It was a promise. No one touches him. One smuggler shouted, "Get the mutt off him!" He raised his rifle, aiming squarely at the shepherd's head. The shot never came. An officer's bullet cracked from the fog, striking the smuggler's shoulder and sending him sprawling. The rifle clattered to the planks. Ares barked once, loud, sharp, explosive, before lowering himself even closer over Caleb, shielding him with every inch of his frame. Another round of fire swept across the deck, bullets hissing like angry bees. Sparks erupted against the railing inches above Caleb's head. The boy flinched again, but pressed his face deeper into Ares's fur, clutching as tightly as the ropes allowed. His muffled sobs shook, but the shepherd did not waver. Ethan, crouched behind a crate on the dock, caught the sight through the haze. His breath caught like a knife in his chest. His boy, his Caleb, was on that deck, and Ares was the only thing standing between him and the rain of bullets. Rage and fear collided inside him, but so did something else, an awe that burned hot. The dog was not just holding the line, he was saving his son. "Push forward," Ethan roared. His men surged closer, firing in unison, trying to cut a path through the fog and fury. On the deck, the smugglers scrambled, their advantage slipping. Some ducked low, firing blindly. Others cursed as officers pressed them tighter. Yet still their eyes flicked to the boy at the railing, calculating, desperate. "Shoot through the mutt," one snarled. His words were answered by Ares's bark, so fierce it rang like defiance itself. The shepherd's body pressed tighter against Caleb, his flank warm, his chest rising and falling like a wall of iron. Bullets sparked again off the deck fittings, showering sparks across the boy's hair. Caleb whimpered, but didn't scream. He pressed harder into the fur, letting the shepherd's heartbeat steady his own. Time blurred. Each second was a lifetime. The dog stood unyielding, absorbing the chaos, every muscle taut, every breath drawn for the boy behind him. Sparks flew, wood split, men shouted, but Ares did not falter. And in that moment, Caleb understood something he would never forget. Heroes didn't always walk on two legs. Sometimes they crouched low in the firestorm, their bodies the only shield between a child and the darkness. He whispered it, muffled against the fur. "You're my hero." Ares's ears flicked, and his growl deepened, as though he understood. The firefight raged, but something had shifted. A line had been drawn on that deck, not by rifles or knives, but by 4 paws planted in defiance. And no bullet, no man, no storm of greed would cross it. The trawler heaved in the restless tide, as though the sea itself sensed the violence unfolding on its deck. Moments earlier, bullets had lit the fog like sparks, but now the battle turned brutal and close. "Go! Go! Take the deck!" The gangplank rattled under armored boots. Ethan Ward was among the first aboard, pistol raised, jaw clenched. He had spent years breaking smuggling rings, but never had his blood burned like this. His son was tied to that railing. Nothing would stop him. The smugglers, low on ammunition, lunged with knives and pipes. Shadows collided against crates, fists cracked jaws, steel clanged on wood. The tide slammed the hull, pitching men into each other, blood slicking the planks. Ares, the shepherd, tore into the fray first. He hit a smuggler reaching for a knife, his jaws locking on the man's arm until bone struck the deck. Daniel shouted through the chaos, "Cover the dog!" as his pistol forced another smuggler behind a crate. Ethan glimpsed Caleb bound against the railing, small, trembling, his face streaked with tears. Rage surged. He slammed into a man swinging a pipe, fists hammering ribs until the weapon clattered away. He hurled the smuggler aside and shouted, raw and desperate, "Caleb, hold on!" The boy's lips trembled, but he nodded, whispering his father's words. Stand while afraid. The smugglers fought like cornered animals. One swung a chain. Another drove an officer into the mast. Blades screeched against batons. But Ares was a storm. He leapt over crates, his growl shattering courage, his teeth knocking a knife-wielding man sprawling before the blade could strike Ethan. A bullet ricocheted into the railing inches above Caleb's head. He flinched, curling tighter, but Ares pressed close again, shielding him. Caleb whispered into fur, voice shaking but steady, "You're my shield." The ship tilted sharply, waves slamming, men stumbled. Ethan's voice cut through the roar. "Push them back!" His officers rallied, driving smugglers toward the stern. Batons cracked, Fists landed, bodies dropped to the deck, blood mixed with salt water. The air stank of sweat, iron, and powder. Ethan wrestled another man against the rail, twisting a knife free. Rage nearly consumed him, until Ares barked, sharp and grounding. Ethan inhaled hard, cuffed the man, and shoved him down. Minutes stretched like hours. One by one, the smugglers fell. Shackles clattered onto wrists, their curses thinning to groans. Caleb trembled, but lived. And for Ethan, alive was everything. The last smuggler standing lunged, not at Ethan, but at Caleb. A knife flashed. Ares exploded forward, slamming the man down, teeth locked on his wrist. The blade clattered harmlessly away. Ethan kicked it aside, clamped cuffs on, and barked, "Easy, Ares!" The shepherd released at once, backing off with a thunderous snarl. Silence followed, broken only by the groan of prisoners and the ceaseless tide. Lanterns swayed, smoke curled into fog, and the trawler groaned under defeat. "It's done," Daniels muttered. Officers confirmed. The deck was secure, but Ethan's eyes, fixed only on his son, still tied to the railing, small and bowed. He dropped his pistol and ran. Ares was already there, pressed against the boy, chest heaving, but unmoved. His stance seemed to say, "I held him for you. Now take him back." Ethan dropped to his knees, hands shaking at the knots. "Hold still, Caleb. I've got you." The ropes were soaked and cruelly tight. "Knife!" he barked. An officer rushed one forward. Ethan slashed until the final strand snapped. The bindings fell away. For a moment, Caleb didn't move. His arms hung limp, trembling with exhaustion. Then, with a sob that tore from his chest, he collapsed forward, into Ares. His arms wrapped tight around the shepherd's neck, face buried in fur, sobs breaking free at last. Ares lowered himself carefully, bracing to hold the boy. He didn't flinch or shift. He simply let Caleb cling, chest rising steady beneath the child's cheek. Ethan's hand rested on his son's back, throat tight, eyes blurred. He wanted to pull Caleb into his own arms, but he understood. Tonight, the shepherd had been the shield. Caleb needed the heartbeat that had drowned out gunfire, the courage that refused to move. "It's okay," Ethan whispered. His hand rested on both boy and dog. "You're safe now. Both of you." Caleb's words came in hiccuped fragments. He saved me." "Don't let them take him away." Ethan's voice was husky when he answered, "No one's taking him. Not now. Not ever." Around them, officers hauled prisoners, radios crackled, chains rattled, but the world seemed to fade. In their small circle of boy, father, and dog, time held still. Ethan finally lifted Caleb's tear-streaked face from the shepherd's fur. "You're brave," he whispered. "No, I was so scared." "So was I," Ethan admitted, pulling him close at last. But that's what bravery is, standing even when you're afraid. Ares pressed against them both, forming the last piece of the embrace. For a moment, the three knelt together on the deck, bound not by rope, but by something stronger: love, loyalty, survival, forged in fire. The harbor groaned, the tide slapped, and officers moved. But in that corner of the trawler, a child sobbed into fur, a father wept into his son's hair, and a shepherd stood steady, carrying the weight of both. The chains had shattered. And in their place, something far stronger had been forged. The trawler heaved in the restless tide as though the sea itself sensed the violence unfolding on its deck. Moments earlier, bullets had lit the fog like sparks, but now the battle had turned brutal and close. "Go! Go! Take the deck!" The gangplank rattled under armored boots. Ethan Ward was among the first aboard, pistol raised, jaw clenched. He had spent years breaking smuggling rings, but never had his blood burned like this. His son was tied to that railing. Nothing would stop him. The smugglers, low on ammunition, lunged with knives and pipes. Shadows collided against crates. Fists cracked jaws. Steel clanged on wood. The tide slammed the hull, pitching men into each other, blood slicking the planks. Ares the shepherd tore into the fray first. He hit a smuggler reaching for a knife, jaws locking until bones struck deck. Daniel shouted, "Cover the dog!" as his pistol forced another man behind a crate. Ethan glimpsed Caleb bound against the railing, small, trembling, face streaked with tears. Rage surged. He slammed into a man swinging a pipe, fists hammering ribs, until the weapon clattered away. He hurled the smuggler aside and shouted, raw and desperate, "Caleb, hold on!" The boy's lips trembled, but he nodded, whispering his father's words. Stand while afraid. The smugglers fought like cornered animals. One swung a chain, another drove an officer into the mast. Blades screeched against batons. But Ares was a storm. He leapt over crates, his growl shattering courage, his teeth knocking a knife-wielding man sprawling before the blade could strike Ethan. A bullet ricocheted into the railing inches above Caleb's head. He flinched, curling tighter, but Ares pressed close, shielding him. Caleb whispered into fur, voice shaking but steady. "You're my shield." The ship tilted sharply, waves slamming. Ethan's voice cut through the roar. "Push them back!" His officers rallied, driving smugglers toward the stern. Batons cracked, fists landed, bodies dropped to the deck. Minutes stretched like hours. One by one, the smugglers fell. Shackles clattered onto wrists, their curses thinning to groans. Caleb trembled, but lived. And for Ethan, alive was everything. The last smuggler standing lunged, not at Ethan, but at Caleb. A knife flashed. Ares exploded forward, slamming the man down, teeth locked on his wrist. The blade clattered harmlessly away. Ethan kicked it aside, clamped cuffs on, and barked, "Easy, Ares!" The shepherd released at once, backing off with a thunderous snarl. Silence followed, broken only by the groan of prisoners and the ceaseless tide. Lanterns swayed, smoke curled into fog, and the trawler groaned under defeat. "It's done," Daniels muttered. Officers confirmed. The deck was secure. But Ethan's eyes fixed only on his son, still tied to the railing, small and bowed. He dropped his pistol and ran. Ares was already there, pressed against the boy, chest heaving but unmoved. His stance seemed to say, "I held him for you. Now take him back." Ethan dropped to his knees, hands shaking at the knots. "Hold still, Caleb. I've got you." The ropes were soaked and cruelly tight. "Knife!" he barked. An officer rushed one forward. Ethan slashed until the final strand snapped. The bindings fell away. For a moment, Caleb didn't move. His arms hung limp, trembling with exhaustion. Then, with a sob that tore from his chest, he collapsed forward, into Ares. His arms wrapped tight around the shepherd's neck, face buried in fur, sobs breaking free at last. Ares lowered himself carefully, bracing to hold the boy. He didn't flinch or shift. He simply let Caleb cling, chest rising steady beneath the child's cheek. Ethan's hand rested on his son's back, throat tight, eyes blurred. He wanted to pull Caleb into his own arms, but he understood. Tonight, the shepherd had been the shield. Caleb needed the heartbeat that had drowned out gunfire, the courage that refused to move. "It's okay," Ethan whispered. His hand rested on both boy and dog. "You're safe now, both of you." Caleb's words came in hiccuped fragments. He saved me. Don't let them take him away." Ethan's voice was husky when he answered, "No one's taking him. Not now. Not ever." Around them, officers hauled prisoners. Radios crackled, chains rattled. But the world seemed to fade. In their small circle of boy, father, and dog, time held still. Ethan finally lifted Caleb's tear-streaked face from the shepherd's fur. "You're brave," he whispered. "No, I was so scared." "So was I," Ethan admitted, pulling him close at last. "But that's what bravery is. Standing even when you're afraid." Ares pressed against them both, forming the last piece of the embrace. For a moment, the three knelt together on the deck, bound not by rope, but by something stronger. Love, loyalty, survival forged in fire. The harbor had quieted, but only in the way a battlefield quiets once the guns fall silent. Smoke and salt still hung heavy. Shackled smugglers groaned where they had fallen, their curses weak, their power gone. On the pier, red and blue lights cut the fog as police cruisers lined the wharf. Sirens wailed like echoes of grief. And in the middle of it all stood Ethan Ward, his son leaning into him, Ares pressed close at their side. Neighbors had gathered, first in twos and threes, then in clusters, wrapped in coats against the dawn chill. They whispered as officers marched prisoners down the gangplank. But their eyes always returned to one thing: the boy, alive, and the shepherd who had stood guard over him. Stories were already bending into legend. Some swore they'd seen bullets spark harmlessly against the dog's vest. Others whispered that no beast could shield a child so fiercely unless he understood love itself. Deputy Cole raised his voice for all to hear. "These docks won't be the same after tonight. No longer a place of fear. This harbor now stands as proof that loyalty and courage can stand against the darkest men." Applause rose, steady, reverent, not for victory alone, but for survival. Caleb stirred in his father's arms, lifting his tear-streaked face. His voice was hoarse but sure. "He saved me." A hush rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to Ares. The shepherd didn't preen or move. He simply sat steady as the tide, amber eyes fixed on the boy. And in that stillness, he seemed larger than life, not just a police dog, a shield. Ethan kissed Caleb's hair, his own eyes wet. "No. He never will let them hurt you." Around them, officers exchanged quiet nods. Townsfolk crossed themselves, and even the shackled smugglers looked on with bitter awe. Ares ignored them all. His only measure was the boy's trembling hand buried in his fur. The mist thinned as dawn bled into the horizon. The tide slapped gently at the pilings, calmer now, as if the sea itself bore witness. Ethan tightened his arms around Caleb and rested his other hand on the dog's shoulder. "You changed this place tonight," he whispered, low enough for only them to hear. Caleb smiled faintly through tears, and the town, watching, whispering, remembering, knew this story would outlive fog, sirens, even scars. The harbor was no longer just a harbor. It was a witness. The Ward home had always been a place of warmth, creaking pine floors, quilts folded neatly on couches, the quiet hum of safety in its walls. But in the days after the harbor, even home felt changed. Shadows lingered longer, silence pressed heavier. Most nights, Ethan sat awake, listening, Not to the creak of old wood, but to the restless breaths coming from Caleb's room. His son hadn't been the same since that night. No child could be. The clock whispered past midnight when Ethan heard it. A cry, sharp and broken. He was on his feet instantly, pushing open Caleb's door. The boy tossed beneath his quilt, hands clutching fabric as though it were rope. Sweat dampened his hair, his voice tight and fragile. "No, don't, Dad!" Ethan's throat closed. He knelt at the bedside, his hands hovering before resting gently on his son's shoulders. "Caleb, it's me. You're safe. You're home." But the boy didn't wake. His legs kicked, his body curling tighter. Ethan wanted to pull him into his arms, to shake the nightmare away. Instead, he froze, helpless. A shadow moved in the doorway. Aries padded silently in, nails clicking faintly against the floorboards. Without hesitation, the shepherd leapt onto the bed and pressed close, warm and steady. His nose nudged Caleb's shoulder, a soft whine escaping. Caleb's hands released the quilt and found fur instead. Even in sleep, his fingers clutched tight. His whimpers softened, his breathing slowed. Aries lowered his head across the boy's chest, his weight anchoring him to peace. Ethan stood in the dim light, chest tight. He had fought men and bullets to save Caleb, but here he was powerless. It was the dog who fought the ghosts, and won. Minutes passed. Caleb's body eased, his lips whispering faintly, "Stay with me." Aries' tail gave one slow thump, a promise made without words. Ethan pressed a hand to his mouth, tears burning. Gratitude overrode sorrow as he crouched, stroking both boy and shepherd. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't ever leave him. He needs you more than me right now." The shepherd closed his eyes, chest rising in rhythm with the boy's. The nightmare had been calmed. At last, Ethan left them, carrying the image with him, his son curled against fur, both breathing as one. Healing had begun. The nights stretched long in the Ward household. Caleb still woke trembling, gasping, as though waves dragged him under. Ethan would rush in, but his arms could only do so much. It was Aries who changed that. Now, when the boy cried out, the shepherd didn't wait for a command. He came of his own accord, nails tapping softly across the floor, slipping into the room like a shadow with amber eyes. He climbed onto the bed, pressed close, and stayed. This night was no different. Caleb stirred with a whimper, whispering, "Don't. Please don't." Aries padded to his side, pressed his nose to the boy's arm, and leapt onto the mattress. Caleb's eyes flew open, wide with fear, until he saw that gaze. Relief rushed out in a shaky breath. "Aries." His hand buried into fur, trembling fingers tangling deep. The ropes loosened their hold. The phantom waves faded. "Don't go," he whispered. "Stay." The shepherd's answer was stillness. His weight was heavy, anchoring, his tail flicking once before he settled. Caleb's breathing slowed, his eyelids heavy now, not with fear, but comfort. His last words before sleep claimed him were fragile, but certain. "You're my hero." Ethan, watching from the doorway, felt his throat close. He had fought shadows to bring Caleb back, but it was this dog who carried him into peace. Later, when the boy finally slept, Ethan stepped out onto the porch. The cool air smelled of pine and salt. He sank into the old wooden chair, head bowed, hands clasped. The harbor replayed in his mind. The mist, the gunfire, the sight of Caleb lashed to the railing. He pressed a hand hard against his face. "God, what have I done?" he whispered. But gratitude cut through the guilt. He remembered Ares leaping into the fray, planting himself against Caleb, sparks flying around him. Without that dog, his boy wouldn't be alive. The porch door creaked. Ethan turned, expecting Caleb. Instead, it was Ares. The shepherd padded across the boards and sat beside him, warm flank pressing against his leg. Ethan let out a shaky breath, his hand sinking into fur. "You knew I needed you," he murmured. Together, they sat in silence, man and dog, father and guardian. Through the upstairs window, Ethan saw the glow of Caleb's nightlight. He pictured his son asleep, hands still tangled in fur. The image steadied him. He stroked the shepherd's back, his voice soft. "We'll get through this. Him, me, you. We'll heal." The dog's tail thumped once against the porch, slow and certain. And for the first time since the harbor, Ethan believed it. The sun was higher than it had been in Caleb's world for a long time. Spring light poured across the training field behind the precinct, warming the grass still damp with morning dew. Officers guided their canine partners through drills: sit, heal, search, retrieve. Commands rang out, followed by praise, the rhythm of discipline and trust. At the edge of the field, Caleb stood with his hands tucked nervously into his jacket. Ethan crouched beside him, sensing the boy's hesitation. After the harbor, after the nightmares, he had almost kept his son far from anything that smelled of danger. But a counselor's words had stayed with him. Healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from reshaping the memory. "Ready, buddy?" Ethan asked. Caleb's eyes flicked toward the shepherd waiting on the field, vest snug, tail giving a patient thump. The boy swallowed but nodded. Ares's ears perked as they approached. His body shifted with quiet anticipation, amber eyes locking onto the boy with recognition that cut through Caleb's lingering fear. Daniels, the handler, kept his voice easy. "We'll keep it simple. Just commands and some play." Caleb's shoes sank into the grass. For a moment, the smell of rope and the echo of waves returned. But then Ares lowered his head, muzzle brushing the boy's hand. The warmth of that gesture broke the fog. Caleb's fingers curled instinctively into fur. Daniels gave a firm command. "Sit." Ares obeyed instantly, gaze still fixed on the boy. Caleb blinked in surprise. A small laugh escaped him, fragile, but real. It was the first since the harbor. "See?" Daniel said softly. "He listens. Now try it yourself." The boy glanced at his father. Ethan nodded, smiling through tight eyes. Caleb drew a breath. "Sit," he said, his voice small. Ares obeyed without hesitation. Caleb gasped, then laughed again, brighter this time, spilling out like sunlight after a storm. "He listened to me." "He trusts you," Ethan said, pride thick in his voice. "Just like you trust him." An hour passed in a steady rhythm. Caleb called shaky commands: "Stay," "Come," "Down." Each time, Ares responded with precision, never breaking his gaze. With every success, Caleb's laughter rang louder, each sound loosening the shadows that clung to him. At last, Daniels handed the boy a tug toy. "Your turn. Play with him." Caleb gripped it with both hands. Ares crouched, eyes bright, tail lashing. The shepherd lunged, teeth clamping onto the toy with controlled strength. Caleb squealed, tugging back, laughter carrying across the field as the dog growled playfully. For the first time since that night, joy bloomed unguarded on his face. When the game ended, Caleb collapsed into the grass, breathless with giggles. Aries flopped beside him, tongue lolling, rolling onto his side. The boy reached automatically for fur, burying his fingers deep. He sighed with a relief that sounded almost like release. "I'm not scared when you're here," he whispered. Ethan crouched beside them, brushing hair from his son's forehead. "That's because you've got the bravest friend in the world." Caleb's eyes softened. "Our hero." And under the spring sun, trust began to stitch the wounds left by ropes and waves. Healing arrived not in grand gestures, but in a boy's laughter, a shepherd's paw pressed into grass, and a father's tears held back in quiet pride. The town hall had never been so full. Every seat was taken. Neighbors pressed shoulder to shoulder. Families leaned against the back wall. Children perched on laps to see the stage. The air buzzed not with fear, as in the days of smuggling, but with anticipation. Tonight, Greyport had gathered not to mourn, but to honor. At the center of the stage sat Aries. His vest gleamed, white letters, Police Cayenne, catching the lights. He sat tall, steady, ears alert, eyes scanning the crowd as if still on duty. In the front row, Caleb swung his legs nervously, hands fidgeting in his lap. He had whispered to Ethan that he didn't like crowds, yet when he looked at Aries, his shoulders eased. The shepherd was there. That was enough. The mayor stepped to the podium, his voice deep but warm. "Citizens of Greyport, for too long our harbor belonged to the shadows, but tonight we stand free. And we owe that freedom not only to our officers, but to a partner who stood against the darkness when it mattered most." Every eye turned to the shepherd. On that night, when bullets flew, one dog leapt into the fire. He shielded a child with his own body. He showed us courage is not measured in words or even badges, but in loyalty and love. Applause erupted, rolling like a wave. People rose, clapping harder, louder, cheers echoing through the rafters. An officer stepped forward with a velvet-lined box. Inside lay a medal engraved with the town's crest, ribbon gleaming red and gold. The mayor crouched, slipping it gently over Aries's neck. For a breath, silence held. Then the applause came again, thunderous, shaking the hall. Aries sat unflinching, tail thumping once against the stage floor. It was all the acknowledgement he gave. And it was enough. But Caleb wasn't content with applause. He slipped from his seat, darting up the steps, and ran straight to the shepherd. The crowd hushed. The boy wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face into fur. "I love you," he whispered. "You're my hero." The hall erupted, not polite clapping, but cheers raw with gratitude. Mothers wept, fathers wiped eyes, children pointed with wide smiles. Even hardened officers stood straighter, their throats tight. On stage, Aries pressed his muzzle gently against the boy's shoulder. The medal gleamed, but the true honor was Caleb's embrace. And in that moment, Greyport understood. A legend had been born, not of speeches or gold, but of loyalty sealed in fur and tears. Hours later, the applause still echoed in Ethan's mind as he guided his son up the porch steps. Aries padded close, the medal glinting in the porch light. Inside, the house smelled of pine wood and quiet. Caleb lingered in the hall, staring up at his father. His voice was small, almost lost. "Dad, will it happen again?" Ethan froze. The question wasn't about smugglers. It was about danger, absence, the fear that the world might tear his father away again. He crouched, placing his hands gently on his son's shoulders. "No, not like this. Not ever again." "But you always have to go," Caleb whispered. "To work, to the bad places." Ethan's chest tightened. Years of service, of missed dinners and broken promises, pressed down on him. He had told himself it was for Caleb, for the town's safety, for the boy's future. But looking into his son's eyes now, he saw what those choices had cost. "You're right," he admitted, voice rough. "I thought protecting this town was enough. But I forgot that being your father comes before being anyone else's officer." Caleb's lip trembled. "On the boat, I prayed, but I thought maybe you wouldn't come." His voice cracked. Ethan pulled him close, arms wrapping tight. Tears burned his eyes. "I almost lost you because I wasn't here when you needed me most. I won't make that mistake again." He pulled back, holding Caleb by the shoulders so the boy could see his face. "I promise you, son, never again will duty blind me to you. If it comes down to the town or to you, I choose you. Always you." The boy's tears fell freely, but so did a small, relieved smile. He clung to his father's neck. "I just want you here." "And I will be," Ethan said, pressing a kiss into his hair. "For every nightmare, every laugh, every moment, that's my vow." Beside them, Ares lifted his head, giving one soft chuff as if sealing the promise. His amber eyes glowed steady in the dim light. Ethan rested one hand on the shepherd's back, while holding his son with the other. "And we'll do it together. You, me, and him. We're a team now. Nothing breaks that." Caleb's fingers brushed the medal still hanging from Ares's neck. "He's part of us." "Always," Ethan said. For the first time since the harbor, guilt loosened its grip. Not gone, but reshaped into resolve. Tonight, a vow had been carved in love, witnessed by the only two souls who mattered most. The night settled deeper around the house, calm and quiet. Inside, a father held his son. A dog lay watchful, and a promise bound them together, stronger than any chain. The courthouse of Greyport was not built for spectacle. Its walls were plain stone, its benches worn smooth by years of small disputes. But on this day the hall was packed, every seat filled, every aisle lined. The air buzzed with tension. The smugglers who had ruled the harbor now sat shackled at the defense table. Their ringleader, Donovan, broad-shouldered and cold-eyed, leaned back in his chair, sneering even in chains. His men whispered among themselves, their voices sharp, their gazes filled with threats. When the bailiff called the room to order, silence fell. Judge McAllister entered, his lined face grave. "The case of the state versus Donovan and Associates will proceed." Witnesses came first, officers recounting the raid, neighbors speaking of years of fear. Daniels testified about the shepherd's leap through gunfire, his voice steady, planting awe into every listener. But the smugglers only sneered. Then came the name that hushed the hall. "Caleb Ward," the prosecutor called. A murmur swept the crowd. Ethan leaned close to his son, seated in the front row. "You don't have to be loud. Just be you. Tell the truth. That's enough." Caleb slid from the bench, his steps small but heavy. At the stand, the bailiff swore him in. His hand trembled as he raised it. The prosecutor's voice softened. "Caleb, can you tell us what happened that night?" The boy's gaze flicked toward the defense table. Donovan's eyes locked on him, venomous. "Careful what you say, boy," he growled. The judge's gavel cracked. "Order!" Officers moved closer, their hands on weapons. Donovan leaned back, smirk still etched, but Caleb trembled. His hands clutched the chair. For a moment it seemed he might falter. Then, From the front row, Ares shifted. The shepherd sat tall, amber eyes fixed on him. Caleb's breath caught. He remembered fur beneath his fingers, the steady heartbeat that had drowned out gunfire. He inhaled and spoke, voice soft but clear. They tied me to the railing. They said no one was coming, but they were wrong. My dad came, and Ares came. He stood in front of me when the bullets came. He saved me. The silence was absolute. The prosecutor leaned forward. And the men who tied you, are they in this room? Caleb nodded. His hand rose, trembling but firm, pointing toward the defense table. It was them. Donovan lurched forward, snarling. You'll regret this. Enough! The judge thundered, gavel slamming. One more word and you'll be gagged. For the first time, the ringleader's smirk faded. Fear flickered in his eyes. Caleb exhaled shakily, but his chin lifted. He had stood. Ethan's chest swelled with pride, so fierce it hurt. His son had faced the men who tried to break him and spoken the truth. The prosecutor turned to the jury. You've heard it from the boy himself. When Caleb stepped down, neighbors whispered words like bravery and courage. Ares's tail thumped once against the floorboards, sealing the testimony. Caleb returned to the bench, and Ethan pulled him close. You were brave, son. Braver than anyone here. The trial would go on, verdicts and sentences to follow, but the heart of it had already been decided. The first light of dawn touched Greyport Harbor, painting the mist in pale rose and gold. The tide lapped gently against pilings, softer now, as though the sea itself was tired of carrying secrets. Ethan walked Dock 12 with Ares at his side. The shepherd wore no vest, only his fur gleaming in the light, yet he moved like a sentinel, ears flicking, eyes scanning. Ethan's boots struck heavily. He had walked these planks countless times, chasing smugglers, tracing shadows. But this morning, the air smelled not of danger, but of memory. He stopped at the place where the gangplank had rattled under charging boots. He could still see Caleb bound to the railing, the fight raging. The memory tightened his chest, but no longer hollowed him. Fear had lived here. Now, vigilance did. Ares sniffed at the boards where crates once splintered, then looked up, tail thumping once. He remembered too. But for him, memory was not wound, but duty. Ethan crouched, resting a hand on the dog's back. You still smell it, don't you? The smoke, the ropes. The shepherd pressed his head gently against Ethan's arm. Ethan exhaled and looked out across the water. For years, the sea had been the smuggler's ally. But in this dawn light, it promised something else. Renewal. He thought of Caleb on the stand, pointing with a trembling hand. He thought of his son's laughter during training, of the word he had whispered into fur. Hero. The harbor had taken much, but it had also given them back a chance to rebuild stronger. Ethan rose, brushing the railing where Caleb had once been tied. From now on, he murmured, voice carrying only to the shepherd, this dock is ours, not theirs. Never again theirs. Ares's tail thumped again. At the end of the pier, the town stretched behind them, rooftops glowing in dawn's light. Ahead lay only the horizon. Ethan breathed deep, salt air filling his lungs, steady and sharp. For the first time in years, he felt peace. Not the fragile kind that denies danger, but the kind born of resolve to meet it and win. He looked down. Ares sat poised, eyes reflecting the sunrise. You saved him, Ethan said quietly. And you saved me. I'll never forget that. The shepherd leaned forward. pressing his muzzle against Ethan's hand. Simple. Steady. Enough. Together they stood at the dock's edge, guardians of memory and of a harbor reborn. That afternoon, sunlight spilled across the ward home. Caleb sat at the dining table, colored pencils scattered, his head bent over paper. Aries lay nearby, head on paws, ears twitching. Ethan watched from the doorway. His son's strokes were careful, deliberate. Slowly the shape emerged, pointed ears, a broad chest, a steady stance. The proportions wavered, the pause uneven, but the essence was clear. Strength, loyalty, presence. At last Caleb leaned back, smudges of graphite on his cheek. He reached for a red pencil and, in uneven letters, wrote beneath the drawing, "My hero." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any verdict. Caleb stared at them, eyes glistening, then looked at the shepherd. "You saved me," he whispered. Sliding off his chair, he clutched the paper in one hand and wrapped his other arm around Aries' neck. The dog shifted closer, tail brushing the floor once, pressing his muzzle into the boy's shoulder. Ethan stepped forward, resting a hand on his son's back. His throat tightened as he saw the crooked letters. "That's beautiful, buddy." Caleb showed him. "It's Aries. The way he looked that night. I don't ever want to forget." Ethan crouched. The drawing was rough, but it was truth captured in pencil. And beneath it, the words that undid him. "My hero." Tears pricked his eyes. He pulled his son close. "He is, Caleb, and so are you." The boy shook his head. "He was brave." "Braver than me?" "Bravery isn't about not being afraid," Ethan said, voice breaking. "You stood. You survived. That's bravery too." Caleb studied the drawing, smoothing the paper with small fingers. His voice was quiet, but sure. "Then, maybe we're both heroes." Aries gave a soft chuff, as though agreeing. Later, Caleb taped the drawing to the refrigerator, its crooked lines framed by magnets shaped like seashells. Each time someone walked into the kitchen, it caught the eye, not for its artistry, but for its truth. It wasn't just paper and pencil, it was testimony. A keepsake from a child who had stared into darkness and found light in 4 paws and a steady heart. And though the paper would one day yellow, the words beneath the sketch would remain etched in memory, as enduring as the tide itself. My hero. The evening had settled softly over Greyport, painting the sky in fading shades of lavender and amber. Harbor lights flickered in the distance, their glow stretching across the tide like ribbons of memory. Crickets chirped from the tall grass by the fence, and the porch light hummed faintly against the cool spring air. On the Ward family porch, Caleb lay curled against Aries. He had dragged out a quilt from the living room, spreading it clumsily across the boards before settling beside the shepherd. His small frame leaned into the dog's warmth, one hand buried deep in the thick fur at his chest. His eyes were heavy, his breaths slowing, the weight of a long day pulling him toward sleep. Aries did not move. His body was steady, ears flicking only at the occasional rustle of leaves or distant gate creak. His amber eyes glowed faintly in the porch light as he kept watch, chest rising in the calm rhythm of a guardian at rest. The boy used him as a pillow and shield, and the shepherd accepted the role without question. The screen door creaked open behind them. Ethan stepped quietly onto the porch, coffee cup forgotten in his hand. He paused at the sight before him. His son safe, his dog watchful, the quilt bundled around both. For a long moment he simply stood, letting the image carve itself into memory. This was what he had nearly lost. This was what he would never take for granted again. Ethan lowered himself into the old chair beside them. He leaned forward, resting one hand gently on Caleb's back, the other on Ares's shoulder. The boy stirred faintly, but did not wake. The dog's eyes shifted briefly toward him, then back to the dark beyond the fence, as though to say, "I've got him. Rest easy." Ethan exhaled, a long breath that carried months of weight. For so long, the harbor had been a shadow, the house haunted by nightmares. But tonight, there was only stillness, only peace. He felt the tide of guilt ease at last, replaced by something sturdier, gratitude. The night deepened. Caleb's breathing settled into the steady rhythm of sleep. Ares's tail brushed once against the porch, slow and certain. And Ethan sat with them, a man who had learned the hardest way what truly mattered. The porch light glowed, casting a soft halo around father, son, and shepherd. In that circle of light, the world was simple. Love, loyalty, and the quiet promise of safety. And as crickets sang, and the harbor breathed beyond the hills, Greyport finally slept under a peace it had almost forgotten. Inside the house, Ethan lingered near the doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the scene before him. The sight struck him harder than anything had in months. Harder than the raid, harder than the trial, harder even than hearing his son's trembling testimony in court. Because this was peace. Real peace. For weeks, Caleb had been haunted by nightmares, flinching at shadows, his laughter buried under fear. But here, in the glow of twilight, wrapped in a quilt and pressed against the shepherd's side, he looked safe, whole. His face, softened by sleep, bore none of the terror Ethan had seen on the deck of that trawler. Ethan's throat tightened. He blinked hard, his vision swimming. He had always believed his job was to protect the town, to carry the badge as a shield against the shadows. But watching his son now, he understood something deeper. It wasn't the badge that had saved Caleb that night. It wasn't the years of training or the endless hours of patrol. It was loyalty, fierce, unshakable, wordless loyalty, embodied in 4 paws and a shepherd's heart. Ares shifted slightly, lowering his head until his muzzle rested gently on Caleb's shoulder. The boy stirred but didn't wake, only burrowed closer, his fingers tightening in fur. The shepherd's tail brushed the boards once, slow and deliberate, as though affirming the bond. Ethan stepped forward, the porch boards creaking softly under his boots. He crouched beside them, his hand reaching to brush hair from Caleb's forehead. The boy sighed in his sleep, pressing closer to the shepherd's warmth. Tears blurred Ethan's eyes again. He rested his hand briefly on Ares's back, fingers sinking into fur, his voice breaking into a whisper only the dog could hear. "Thank you. For everything. For giving me my son back." Ares's ear flicked, his gaze shifting briefly to meet Ethan's. No words passed between them, but none were needed. The shepherd's presence was enough. Ethan leaned back then, lowering himself into the porch chair. He let the night wrap around them, let the sounds of crickets and the rhythm of his son's breathing fill the silence. His heart ached with pride, with gratitude, with something larger than both. And as he sat there, watching the boy curled against the shepherd, his thoughts drifted to the truth he had come to understand. Some heroes carried badges. He had worn one for years, had lived by it, sacrificed for it. Others carried scars, visible or hidden, reminders of battles fought and survived. But the truest heroes, he realized, carried neither. They carried loyalty, quiet, steadfast, unshakable. They carried it on 4 paws, with eyes that never looked away, and hearts that never faltered. The porch light flickered, the harbor lights glowed, and the night deepened around them. Ethan sat with tears in his eyes, his son safe, his family whole, the shepherd at the heart of it all. And in that final embrace, boy, dog, and father bound together, Greyport's story of fear gave way to one of love, courage, and a legend that would never be forgotten. When you spend enough time around dogs, especially a German shepherd, you come to realize they're more than pets. They're family. They stand by us in silence, yet somehow say more with their eyes and their loyalty than most people ever could. Stories like this remind us of the unshakable bond between humans and animals, and how love, in its purest form, often walks in on 4 paws. If you've ever wanted to deepen that connection with your own dog, there's a gentle resource I've come across that might bring you closer together. It's not something you have to do, just something that touched me personally, and I thought you might like it too. Take it as a friend's recommendation, nothing more. Because in the end, what matters most isn't a website or a guide. It's those quiet moments you share with your dog. The way they rest their head on your knee. The way they remind you that loyalty and love don't need words. Give your dog a little extra scratch behind the ears tonight. They've earned it. And so have you.